Y'all ready for this? Welcome to Sports Kid Drama Kid. I'm Jim. I'm the Sports Kid.
I'm Andy. I'm the Drama Kid.
And today, Andy, we're going to talk about a really, really popular sports movie
that I had never heard of.
I had heard about it a lot, probably seen it in passing in college, or it was on TV or whatever, but never really watched it.
I did not even know it existed.
And that movie is Hoosiers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it'll be a good thing for us to do some episodes like this one on iconic sports movies because they kind of fit into the fabric of the sports world in terms of like references and stuff.
Oh, for sure. Like when we watched Tin Cup, I was like, do they ever like on the PGA Tour like make references to Tin Cup? And you were like, constantly.
Yeah. And this is definitely one of those movies. The movie Hoosiers is about Indiana basketball, and it's as we'll get into, a real underdog story. And so it's always cited in actual sports, especially basketball, especially around March Madness time when people are throwing around references. They'll say it's like a Hoosier situation.
I have heard the term Hoosiers because that's like you correct me if I'm wrong, that's University of Indiana's mascot.
Yeah,
correct?
And it's also what they call people from Indiana in general. They sort of adopted that.
Right. So I've heard the word before, but when you were like, we should watch Hoosiers, I was like, I have no idea.
But yeah, anyway, we watched Hoosiers. We watched it together, and then we had separate thoughts about it. So we didn't watch it separately, but
we do not share a mind. We share everything else, though.
So yeah, we watched it together on YouTube TV, which has it for free. It was a made-for-TV version.
Yeah, there were a lot of commercial breaks that had no commercials in them, so they just ended up being very awkward edits.
Yeah. But you've seen Hoosiers, or if not, check it out on YouTube TV.
You've seen it.
But if you haven't, we're going to kind of go through it scene by scene, so you'll still have an idea of what's going on.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. I'm going to first give you just a little background, like Wikipedia style, that stuff I found that was interesting about the movie before we get into like the plot. So the film Hoosiers was inspired by the story of a 1954 Indiana high school basketball team.
I did not realize that when we were watching it.
Milan High School was a very small school that competed in the Indiana State High School Championship the year when they allowed every team to compete against each other, or one of the years. They did this for a while. Now there are divisions in high school basketball in every state where, like, depending on the population of people that go to your school, you'll play against similar size schools.
Okay.
As a way to try to make stuff fair,
because that was a big element of this movie of like, it's a tiny town, a small school.
So apparently they used to do that in Indiana, where it was like everyone can compete in the one thing.
I mean, it's kind of cool.
It's kind of cool because you get this, but I think in the majority of cases nowadays, you would just have a lot of really small, bad schools playing too good of schools and wouldn't be competitive. So anyway, it's based on a real thing, but they kind of fudged everything else about it. Like they use some of the similar like moments and things that happened during that run, but everything else was kind of layered onto that small school succeeds at basketball story. So this movie was made in 1986, referencing back to 1950 basketball. So apparently the writer and the director also shopped this around for a long time before they finally found investment. It was relatively a small movie, and they were both new to directing and writing. So they didn't have the respect of Gene Hackman, the lead role.
Really?
Yeah, and he was, I guess, just a total pain in the ass to work with the entire time.
Really?
Hated them, made their lives really difficult because they were new to it. And then lastly, before we get into it, the composer was Jerry Goldsmith, and he was nominated for an Oscar for this.
For this?
Yes. He also worked with Angelo Pizzo and David Anspaugh, the filmmaker's writer-director of this, on Rudy.
Oh, so they also are responsible for Rudy?
Yeah.
They have a real theme going on.
Yeah. So the movie opens, it's October 1951, and Norman Dale, played by Gene Hackman, is driving through the Indiana countryside. He enters a rural high school in Hickory, Indiana, and looks at all the basketball trophies in their little modest hallway where the classes are going on. It looks like such a small school.
It does. This was funny because like when the movie opened, like we said, it takes place in 1951, but it was made in 1986. So the movie opens, he's driving through the countryside in a very 1950s car, but the music is all like experimental synth music.
Yeah.
And I was like, ugh, I miss this era of filmmaking in the 80s where like no matter what time period the movie took place in, they were just like, we got all these new synths we gotta try.
Yeah, we got a Yamaha DX7. We gotta use one of the patches.
Because that was like the big thing in music at the time was like synths.
Using all those synths.
Yeah.
The bell rings and everyone, comes out of their classrooms, and Norman Dale, the new coach in town, new guy, meets Myra Fleener, a teacher played by Barbara Hershey. Mm-hmm. They have some flirty banter, and she directs him to the office of Cletus Summers, who is, I believe, like in charge of the school or something.
I think he's the principal.
Yeah.
Maybe.
The two men talk about meeting at Buffalo State Teachers College way back in the day, and Cletus has asked Norman here to become the coach of Hickory. And he tells him, your slate's clean here.
Yes.
Sort of setting up a mystery.
Yes, alluding to something in Norman Dale's past. Yeah, the flirty banter with Barbara Hershey's character was mostly just her being incredibly mean to him. Which I was like, good for you, whatever.
Yeah. Very, very questioning of his outsider coming back to Hickory.
Yeah, and it wasn't until we had almost finished the movie that I was like, oh my God, Barbara Hershey from Beaches, because the whole time I was like, who is this woman? She looks so familiar to me.
Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah.
I was thinking during this part, do people actually go back and look at their trophy cases in high school? Because that's such a trope in movies. And I don't even think the jocks who were like in the sports go back and really look at them.
I cannot speak to that. The only place that I am commemorated in my high school is in the hallway where the auditorium is. There's like Colonial Player of the Year, because my high school mascot were the Colonials. It's problematic, I know. And the theater department was called Colonial Players, and my senior year. So I'm on like a little plaque. Now, have I gone back expressly to visit it? No.
You got to go visit your plaque.
But whenever I have been in the school after I have graduated, yeah, I'll look at it. I can't speak to the athletes, though.
And then the last thing here with this opening scene, I noticed that the age gap between Hackman and Fleener seems pretty large.
I like that you yet said Hackman and Fleener. His actual last name, her character's last name.
Sorry, Hackman and Hershey.
Yeah, I didn't look up the math on this, and I often do because I get really distracted by like an age gap.
So apparently Hackman was like 54, but was playing 40 in the movie. And she was probably late 30s.
She was probably like late 30s, and they were like, you're too old to play late 30s.
Yeah, they had it all wrong.
But Gene Hackman can play 14 years younger than he is.
So Cletus introduces Norman to a player in the gym when they're kind of doing a tour of the school as he shows up. And that player is Jimmy Chitwood. He's shooting a basketball, and he says nothing. He's just this mysterious white T-shirt and jeans, like classic kid.
Just, looks like a character in like Grease or something.
Yeah, making all the shots in the gym. You're like, oh, this guy's good.
Yeah, he made every single shot and then didn't say a word. Strong silent type.
Yeah. And then later on, in perfect golden hour lighting, Cletus tells Norman the story of how Jimmy was really upset about the death of their previous coach. And this man was like a father to Jimmy, so he refuses to play basketball because of this loss.
I was confused of like how much time has passed, because they have all this like lore around Jimmy Chitwood of like he refuses to play since the coach died. And I'm like, but didn't you call Norman Dale in because the coach? So what? Has it been like last 2 weeks? Oh, last year. I
think it was like between the seasons.
Oh, okay. So this is the beginning of the new basketball season. Okay, that makes sense.
Somehow conveniently, the coach died right after the last season. And then Jimmy got upset. Poor Jimmy. He was really going through a rough time. I felt for him in that scene when they're describing everything, but I also didn't really relate because he was kept so mysterious that they never really shed any light on that story.
We'll get into this, but the movie is trying to do a lot of things, and it doesn't earn a lot of its moments. They'll like show you a character, give you some backstory, and you're like, oh, I bet this character is going to be important. Then you don't see them again for a long time.
So I think part of this, as could be said for a lot of movies, I was reading about it after, and they said that the movie initially there's a version that's like 2 hours and 45 minutes long, almost an extra hour of scenes that completed a lot of these story arcs, apparently.
And they were like, get rid of it.
Yeah. Then next up, we have a really good scene, classic. Norman encounters a group of locals at a barbershop, which is where they, all meet up, and they're asking him a bunch of questions and interrogating him about the basketball team, what he's going to do with the team, how he needs to do it like it was done before. Why is he here again? If he was in the Navy, which he said he was for a while after coaching.
12 years.
12 years. How is he going to coach now? I mean, they're good questions, but the fact that like this guy was hired, he's not being trusted at all by the town.
Yeah, this scene was very Friday Night Lights meets The Music Man. I kept thinking throughout this, I was like, there's a lot of parallels to The Music Man in this. There are many, many scenes in that show and also like movie versions of that show where it's just a lot of like angry townsfolk.
Yeah.
Especially like male angry townsfolk, and they're like, they got their hats, they're clutching their hats, and they're like,
yep.
So there was, I don't know, a lot of like the group scenes where like you have like the guy who's in his like police uniform and the guy who's like the barber, and like everyone's wearing their profession.
Yeah.
And is like wagging their finger.
But my real profession is basketball.
Is being a fan.
So all the townspeople say that the only way that the team's going to win is if Jimmy Chitwood comes back. That's one of their main points. And they keep telling him, you got to get Jimmy Chitwood back or you're screwed.
Because he makes every basket he shoots.
Yeah. So Norman gets upset or just annoyed and leaves before they're ready for him to leave. This reminded me of the parents in my hometown growing up. I've already told the story about myself getting removed from a basketball team in middle school because of parents. But I related to this because there was sort of a hometown contingency of people that grew up in my hometown and knew everybody, and I wasn't part of that.
Yeah, I mean, this happens, I feel like, so much of like there are always adults in your small town or suburb or whatever that like once you grow up and you're no longer a child and you don't have to look at them as authority figures, you're like, it's really sad.
Yeah, you're like, whoa.
How much you care about what's going on with like children at the local high school, especially if you no longer have kids at the local high school. You're like, what are you doing?
I have one story that I'm remembering right now. I remember going back to my local YMCA in college when I had lost a bunch of weight and was like, definitely had some sort of eating disorder. Was mostly just like partying and lifting and running all the time. And I lost a bunch of weight down to like a place where maybe I would have wanted to be when I was playing basketball in high school, like athletic wise. And I went to this YMCA and I saw one of the very vocal parents of a very popular boy on my teams growing up. And she was like, you look great. And she'd never talked to me before. She like called it out specifically and made a point. But she was one of the parents that like talked shit on me when I was all through high school and middle school and stuff for not being like athletic enough or good enough.
I hate that woman.
It was like she had like remembered this thing and like commented and talked to me after I had like lost some weight. Yeah. And like it was the only reason she was talking to me.
You know what's crazy is weird. I have it like almost the exact same story.
Oh, wow.
Not quite the same, but like when I was in high school, I was constantly feeling self-conscious about my body, and I always wanted to be smaller and I always wanted to lose weight. And it wasn't until college that I succeeded at having an eating disorder.
Yes.
Look, full blown. But when I was in high school, I specifically remember there was this really mean woman who used to work on the shows, and she was like working on getting me a costume for something, and she asked me what my dress size was. And this is when I was in high school. I was probably like 15 years old, and I told her, and she accused me of lying to her because she thought I looked bigger than the dress size that I told her. And then it wasn't the same woman, but like when I came back to watch the show, like my second or third year of college or whatever, and I was also eating disorder chic thin. I do remember like other members of the theater staff being like, oh my God, like you look great. Like, how do you do it? And I'm just like, ugh. Looking back, I'm like, stop talking to people who are in their teens about what their body looks like. That's weird. It's weird. 40, I mean, don't talk to anybody about what their body looks like ever, but yeah.
Yeah, so that was definitely weird. Yeah. So back to the movie. The next morning, before school begins, Myra tells Norman that Jimmy Chitwood's actually her neighbor, and she's been looking out for him, and she doesn't think Jimmy should play basketball. It's not good for him right now.
Yeah, she has decided as his neighbor and like guardian of sorts that like he does not have the emotional fortitude to handle being on the team this year. So like, don't even ask him.
And I thought, like, that's nice of her and all, but what's going on with Jimmy and his actual family and everything? Like, again, great if he doesn't have any. I'm glad that she's looking after him, but like, can we please know a little bit more about like the most mysterious man in town?
I know.
Jimmy Chitwood.
And guess what? You're not going to find it
out. After school, the Huskers are already practicing in the gym when Norman walks in. And George Walker, one of the local guys who's like real into basketball, is already coaching the team when Norman walks in as the coach for like his first day. And he's leading the practice, and he assumes that Norman's going to, sort of grandfather in and let this guy help him with coaching and show him how they've been doing it. And Norman's just like, first of all, you're out of here.
Yeah.
And kicks him out. Obviously, he gets really pissed. And he goes in there and immediately like changes everything about how they practice.
Yes.
He immediately sends away 2 players that aren't like down with his style.
Yeah.
To
Kicks
make a
them
point.
right out.
And now he's down to 5 people, including one of them being the equipment manager, Ollie,
who is very short.
Very short, and says he's only an equipment manager, and he's like immediately like, well, you're playing.
Yeah.
Because we need you.
Yeah. I mean, this whole section was very funny because they then do like a whole montage of him basically doing classic basketball drills with him. I'm assuming. I've never done a basketball drill. You had a real response to this. You were like, I remember, like, what were they doing? They were like running and touching the lines, and you were like, I threw up once doing this.
Norman starts practice by like insisting that basketball is more than just shooting. Okay, so like he's got a point. Yeah. These guys are probably not fundamentally sound, and so he's going to put them through all these drills, passing, the running in place thing. Running up and down the court doing like touchdowns where you go like free throw line and back, half court and back, other free throw line and back, other end zone and back, and that's one. And then you'd have to do multiple of those. I remember all of these because I had a freshman year high school basketball coach who I think after now seeing this movie and really fully comprehending it for the first time, he was basically taking his entire coaching curriculum from Hoosiers. Or from like a 1950s. He had played, I think, in college, in a Wisconsin college. So he was actually a good player. Yeah. But I think he just had such an old school mindset that he was doing these things a lot. So there was a lot of drills like running, dribbling through cones or chairs, running for the sake of running, chopping your feet in place. And then when a whistle or a direction point from the coach is given, you would slide and stuff. All this stuff is good for basketball. But I remember thinking at the time and while watching this, like, you eventually got to apply it to the game because we're just doing drills all the time. And I don't know how this makes me a better player. Like, I know it's helping. It's making me more athletic and stuff. But I was never able to connect all this stuff we're working on with like actual play because there wasn't nearly enough scrimmaging. And this is what he was doing in the movie. He was taking away all actual play. Yeah,
they were like, when are we going to scrimmage? And he's like, we're not. Yeah. I feel like that is like the biggest difference between someone who's a good teacher or coach and like a bad teacher or coach is like, you can like do exercises and stuff with people. And it's the same in theater. You can do exercises and stuff with people, but you then have to share with the class what was the point of the exercise and how does this actually apply to like when we're on stage or like when we're in a game.
Yeah.
The thing that I thought was funny about this was that they show this whole montage of them doing all these drills and, you know, there's music behind it and you're like, look at them go. Yeah. And then the montage stops and one of the parents brings back his son that Norman Dale had kicked out and is like, making his son apologize so that he can come back and play. And Norman Dale's like, we still have a whole hour of practice left. And they had previously said that the practice was like 2 hours or something. And I was like, that whole montage was only an hour?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, one of the guys who gets kicked out comes back or they both end up coming back because they apologize for what they did. Mm-hmm. And then one day, as Cletus and Norman are eating pie at a diner, in pops Wilbur Shooter Flatch, played by none other than Dennis Hopper.
I'm realizing that as we were watching, I did not know the names of any of the characters.
Well, Shooter, I think
they did call him Shooter, yes.
Anyway, this guy comes stumbling in. He's clearly drunk and wearing a worn out coat that someone got at a thrift store right before the shoot.
They dressed him up like a classic hobo clown, basically.
Yeah. Shooter was a former basketball player in this town, and he describes to Norman how, he had this whole glory days and that he knows a ton about basketball. But Shooter's son sees what's going on and sees that he's bothering the new coach and was hitting him up for money, I think. And he's like, that's my dad. Don't worry about him. He's a drunk.
Yeah. So like one of the kids on the team that Norman Dale is coaching, his dad is Shooter.
Yes. And he's like the classic glory days guy who hangs around the high school town trying to relive his old days of being really good.
But he's not like one of the good old boys in the town. Like he doesn't fit in with everybody else because everyone regards him as like the town drunk.
Yes.
Which I'm like, you can't tell me that some of these other men are also alcoholics. Come on. Here's 1951 in Indiana.
Here's where I put a little note. Let's discuss Shooter. Okay. So he's played by Dennis Hopper.
Yes.
And I think we both had the most problems with him out of anything in this movie.
Yes.
Because the way he acts as a drunk in this movie really seems like he's doing like a caricature
100%
of a town drunk.
Yes.
And it doesn't feel like good acting.
It would have worked really well on like a high school theater stage.
Yeah, he was just very over the top, like slurring his words in like a very like cliche way. And the funny thing about this was he almost didn't take the part because he was actually in real life getting over alcohol. So he was like, ooh, I don't want to necessarily play a part where I am an alcoholic because I'm trying to.
Oh, now I feel bad ripping on his performance, but
it's still bad. Like he's like playing it like way over the top.
Well, I actually turned to you at one point during the movie because it occurred to me that I've heard the name Dennis Hopper as like a famous actor, like, on and off for years. I don't know that I have any memory of like seeing him in anything in particular. And so I think I just assumed that he was going to be good. And then I turned to you at one point during the movie. I was like, is Dennis Hopper a bad actor? And you were like, I guess.
Yeah. And he was nominated for an Oscar for supporting role.
Wild.
For that role.
Wild. It's funny. I don't even remember what acting class this was during, but like, at some point, some professor or acting coach or whatever was like guiding everybody on like how to play drunk. And like apparently the way to play drunk, according to whoever this was like you try to act really sober. The idea being, I mean, we both know from experience, when you're drunk, all you're trying to do is act like you're not as drunk as you are. So like apparently the best way to act drunk is to just be like, I am so sober right now.
Because then you'll come off as weird.
Yeah, because then you come off as weird, which like I would say that's definitely true. I have definitely, like there have definitely been times when people are like, are you drunk? And I'm like, no, I am awesome.
One afternoon, as Jimmy is shooting baskets at the school's outdoor court, Norman approaches him again and asks why he wasn't at class. Jimmy doesn't answer. Norman goes on to tell him that he believes Jimmy has a special talent and that only belongs to Jimmy. And before Norman leaves, he says, hey, take your time. I don't need you to join the team. No pressure, essentially. So
I only visited you at your house.
Yeah, to just throw that out. It's like, okay, we know what you're doing, but yeah.
I mean, I appreciate it. Like, I think it's like the right sentiment to say to a teenager who's going through a tough time. But it was funny. I was like, yeah, you drove all the way to his house and like told him he has a special gift. And then you were like, but I don't even care.
Yeah. I wrote down here a little note because this made me think of something. I said it could be reverse psychology, but it did read as like a genuine understanding of Jimmy's situation, which is maybe just Gene Hackman's good acting. And it reminds me of the time when I finally quit playing basketball like competitively in high school. It was a tough pill to swallow at the time, but the varsity head coach, he also taught social studies like Norman in the movie.
That's really
and I
funny.
think like every basketball coach does. And he called myself and one other player into his classroom after tryouts were over. And tryouts were basically like all summer long leading into the official ones. Like we played summer leagues and worked out because we were trying to make the varsity team. Ugh. Anyway, he calls us in and he said that like he appreciated how hard we worked in the summer leagues and in the tryouts, but he wouldn't necessarily have any playing time for us on the team, even if he would put us on the team.
You would be like a bench player.
Yeah, he's like, you guys, I'll put you on the team, but I can't guarantee any playing time at all. And essentially saying...
With both of you at the same time? Interesting.
Yeah. And we both kind of looked at each other and both came to the same conclusion of like, I guess we're done. Like, I want to have a senior year. And I do respect him for doing that, even though at the time I thought I should be on the team and playing all the time, or at least some of the time. I was able to respect him after the fact for just telling us, because then I was able to have a senior year. Yeah. And I like hung out with new friends and partied and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I would say like the right move would be to just like put you on the team and give you some playing time.
Yeah.
But as a secondary option, like it is nice that he was candid with you and like treated you both like adults. I remember this from high school theater as well. I feel like adults who are responsible for high schoolers in any setting where there's going to be a lot of like emotion and competition and like people feeling very like hurt or nervous or whatever, like with a sport or with theater, it's kind of your job as like an educator and a teacher to just let everybody have a chance and have a good time. I know that like there are things at stake, like, you know, winning whatever record and like doing a good show. And like nowadays there's like high school theater awards. I'm like, you guys are the adults in this situation. And as someone now in my 30s looking back, I'm like, I really just wish that the adults had just like tried to let everybody have like a good time in their adolescence.
Yeah.
Instead of, I mean, I guess it does prepare you for the real world, and that like, you know, there are going to be people who are like better and quote unquote more deserving than you are or whatever. But I'm also kind of like, can you just go easy on me? I'm 17.
Yeah. There had been other cases of this, but this was a real one for me where I was like, oh, you can like do the most you think you can do to try to be good at something and still just not be there. And other people will be like, nah.
Yeah, you were in for less of a rude awakening than I was, because I feel like I came out of high school being like, well, I am the most talented and it's all going to work out for me. And you came out of high school being like, cool, people have really fucked me. Yeah. And probably will continue to do so.
So, you know, while the coach is talking to Jimmy and being like, yeah, don't worry about it, don't come back, Myra is watching them because there's nothing else to do.
No,
apparently,
she's like
snooping.
Raking mud or something.
She sees them and she's like, hey, Norman, don't, you know, talk to Jimmy. What did I say? Like, he doesn't want to play basketball. So they begin arguing about Jimmy's future. She thinks that Jimmy's going to end up like Shooter. He's going to be the town drunk that just harkens back to the glory days. And she wants him to get an academic scholarship because he's also smart and get out of the town. So that's why she has such a strong opinion.
There are way more lines about Jimmy Chitwood than that kid ever speaks in the movie. And I'm also like, where is his mom? Like, why are you the one who's like, while you're raking mud, watching him play basketball and making sure nobody approaches him?
Yeah. So Myra also is just generally suspicious of Norman, like way more than I thought that she should be, even about like his past and why is he back here and all that kind of stuff, and gives him a hard time. I thought like she should be a little suspicious, but like being that suspicious right away seemed just like a plot movement device.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were trying to get across the point that like this is a very small town where like new people do not enter very often, and so anyone who chooses to be there and wasn't just like born there is suspect, which again is a Music Man thing, because the opening song of Music Man is basically about how the people of Iowa don't want anyone new coming into Iowa because they hate everybody. So it's like, oh, there's nothing halfway about the Iowa way to treat you when we treat you, which we may not do at all. And like the whole song is about how like we don't want anyone coming in. We hate everyone. We're not nice, whatever. And so I was like, this is basketball Music Man. This is the basketball man.
The basketball man. Yep, really is. So there's a pep session that happens in the high school as the basketball team is preparing for its season. And they introduce the coach and he says something. I don't know if you remember these from high school. Did you have to go to these?
If there were pep rallies at my high school, I did not know about them.
Oh, we had to go to them like all the time.
I have no memory of going to a single pep rally.
I ought to cancel your spring fling. No. Now, I'm not going to do that because we've already paid the DJ.
If they existed, then they were definitely optional.
Okay. I feel like there should have been more of an effort to get more people on the team is what I thought after this.
Yeah.
Because I was like, the school had 60 people. We'll just say it's 30. Yeah, like males, females at the time. And you're telling me that like nobody else from the 30 dudes wants to play in the full packed gym every night. Like, where are the kids?
Yeah.
They have like 5 people that can field the team. It's the most popular thing in Indiana.
They really make it out to be like, this is the most important thing to the people of this town. Yeah. So much so that like Norman Dale can't go anywhere without like, I don't know, the postal worker coming out of it.
And being like, you should play a 2-3 zone.
Exactly. And yet nobody else wants to be on the team.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was a little thing that I noticed.
Yeah.
In the locker room before the first home game, this is the next scene, Norman reminds the team that he taught them in practice that they must pass at least 4 times before attempting a shot.
Yes.
And I was reading about this, and apparently that is what Bobby Knight, the guy who threw the chair, who I guess Norman is based on, used to say. And 4 passes.
We talked about him in the March Madness.
For just a second, I showed you that
he threw a chair,
a firecracker that threw his chair and got fired from Indiana Hoosiers because of that.
Oh,
because of being over the top. Apparently, the guy thought, what if Bobby Knight sort of had to go back to a small town, and that was kind of generally what this.
That was the seed of the idea that ended up as Hoosiers. I see.
Yes. So, in the locker room before this game, he's doing the Bobby Knight thing, and he's like, team, you must pass 4 times before doing anything. Again, this reminds me of what I was talking about earlier, this old school style of like drills and rules ahead of basketball.
Yeah. And as a viewer, I'm sitting here being like, okay, but why?
Yeah.
And I've asked you this before because we've talked about this whenever we watch Wisconsin basketball. Like, you've explained to me that the tradition of like University of Wisconsin basketball is very pass heavy. And we have watched games where literally like, I don't understand that much about what I'm watching sometimes when I'm watching the actual play of basketball, I'll be honest. But I will literally be like, it seems like that guy could take a shot, but they're just passing the ball in a circle. And I don't really know what that's supposed to achieve.
They're trying to create a more open shot. But when that's the whole goal and no one really knows when the shot should happen, then it just becomes
the idea being when you're passing it around, the other team is trying to follow where the ball is. And then eventually, hopefully, you do a quick pass and the other team is like so disoriented that they're not blocking or guarding the person who's shooting.
So what he's trying to do is essentially like create more ball movement.
Right, but why?
Because you want to pass more to kind of move the ball around. And it's not just passing. There's like back cuts and things happening in an offense along with the passing. Good ball movement. If you think about like peak Golden State Warriors, they're like the pinnacle of ball movement. Like whipping the ball around, rotating it quickly first, like a Steph Curry to get just an advantage enough to get a shot off.
I mean, I've seen plays like that you're like, whoa, what just happened? Like all of a sudden, like someone who didn't have the ball has the ball and now they're driving to the basket. So I understand it. It's just when it's like a bunch of 17-year-old guys, you're like, it's literally looks like you're just passing a ball.
They're just playing a rule instead of playing the game. That's when it starts to feel like, okay, the coach just said we had to do this. That's more like something you would do in practice, I would think. Hey, like we're not going to shoot until 4 passes in practice as like a restrictor to just try to get you in the headspace of passing.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the same with like acting where like you will do a lot of goofy things to sort of like find the physicality of the character or find the voice of the character or whatever. But then like it is your job or the director's job or whatever to then like be like, now we're doing the performance and there has to be like nuance. You can't just like go on stage and be like, I am throwing my voice across the auditorium.
You're not going to do the warm up as the show.
Yeah.
Also in this scene right before they, get ready to go on, he's like, only shoot after you pass 4 times. And also Reverend Doty says a prayer for them. And this is where they sort of introduce the preacher and the preacher's son who's on the team, and his name is Strap. And he continues praying silently even after everyone else has like departed the locker room.
Yeah.
And this becomes sort of a running thing they do where they show this guy's super religious and his dad's the preacher who always prays before the game.
Yeah. And they're like about to start and they're like, where is he? And it's like he's like still taking a knee praying in the locker room. I mean, like they make a joke out of it, but overall, like, I don't know. The movie seems to be promoting Christianity a little.
It does. I have some more to say about this later,
great.
So we'll get into it.
Great.
So then we get back to the tip-off of this first home game. Strap finally shows up after praying. In the early game, the Huskers fall behind. Some of the townspeople start yelling at everyone to shoot more instead of doing this passing thing. Jimmy's there watching. Myra and Shooter are there. At halftime, Norman chews everybody out, telling them that they have to do the passing thing before shooting because they weren't doing it. In the second half, one of the players, feeling pressure, decides to just disobey the passing rule, do his own thing. And of course, Norman makes a, example out of him and sits him down, kicks him out. And
even though he like is making shots.
Yeah. And then one of their players fouls out and they have very few players. So now they have to put the guy back in who got taken out for shooting when he wasn't supposed to. But instead of putting him back in, he says, no, we're playing with 4. Again, to prove a point.
Yeah, the ref comes over and is like, Coach, you need another one. He's like, all my team is on the floor.
Yeah. And then after the game, he's like, my instructions are the law, absolutely, without discussion. But I think in this movie, they're actually kind of setting him up as a hard-nosed guy so that they can later break him down a little bit because he does soften.
Yeah, he does. And also, like, I think they're trying to show that, like, he is flawed. Like, this movie is confusing to watch sometimes because, like, you think it's just, like, a straightforward new coach comes in, he's going to, like, turn the team around and, like, teach them his weird ways of playing basketball. And, like, there are still moments where you're like, no, this guy, Norman Dale, also is very flawed, kind of sucks a little bit. So I'm not sure like whose side I'm supposed to be on, which I guess is like probably good filmmaking. I don't know.
The next week, Norman encounters Myra again with her mother, Opal.
Oh, yes.
And Opal invites him to Sunday dinner because she wants to talk basketball with the new coach. Norman does go over there and he helps them grind sorghum on the farm.
What is that?
I guess you grind it into like flour for stuff.
Oh, okay. Yeah. There's a lot of like actors attempting to do like farm work.
Yeah, because they're out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And oftentimes whenever Norman's talking to Myra, it's like on her farm property.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do appreciate that like you can totally tell that they're being set up as like, you know, they're going to fall in love or whatever. Yeah. But I do appreciate that whenever, usually when we see Myra, she's either in her like very unflattering buttoned up teacher's outfit or she's like real laid back in like her farm coverall.
So when he gets a chance to talk to Myra alone, Myra tells Norman a bit about her family and past, including the fact that she left Hickory a few years but then returned. And then he asks her if she ever thought about getting married, and she's like, people in Hickory keep to themselves, and like sort of is coy about it. A few days later, Shooter calls Norman at home out of nowhere and starts giving him unsolicited advice about the Huskers' upcoming game.
Yeah. And
he's like all drunk, but he's speaking truths. And Norman's like, oh, this Shooter guy, though he's a drunk, we could clean him up because he really knows a lot about basketball and I like him.
I did. Yeah. I did find this interesting because I was like, it's funny to me that he's deciding to take a chance on this guy, whereas everyone else in the town who may have also said like correct things to him about basketball, he's like, meh.
Yeah. So that weekend, the Huskers travel on a team bus owned by the preacher, apparently. That was in the IMDb.
Everybody in a small town, everybody has multiple jobs.
Yeah.
The person who is guiding you in prayer is also guiding you down the country lane in his bus.
I'm going to drive really, really bad, and you guys are going to pray that nothing happens wrong. So Strap's father, the priest, is driving them to their first away game at Cedar Knob, the one that Shooter has so eloquently told the coach about.
Briefed Norman on.
It's a tough game, and a drunk Shooter is present. Norman argues with one of the refs, and and then gets thrown out of the game. And then Cletus, the like principal guy, is like the assistant coach, and he has to take over, and he can barely do it. Like he's doesn't look well at all. And they're setting this up because he eventually like has a heart problem and has to go to the hospital right after this. But like the way he's acting that he's like sick is just by like barely talking.
Yeah.
Can't hear him.
This was also a moment where I was like, there isn't enough going on in this movie. Cletus has to go to the hospital.
So the next day, Norman visits Cletus in the hospital because like he had heart trouble after having to step into that game, and he's been ordered on bed rest, which is like a lot of this in this movie is just like sending people to the hospital. We'll get to that.
A lot of the movie is like we have so little people to get the job done, and then they keep falling off for whatever reason.
And then after, seeing Cletus, who's down and out, Norman goes to see Shooter, and he's also in like his dilapidated shithole cabin in the woods.
Yeah.
Where he's living like with no heat or anything.
That was a little harrowing.
Yeah. And he offers to make Shooter his assistant if he can be sober. And Shooter's a little like offended and embarrassed and says like, no, leave. Like, I don't do that.
Yeah, like he's excited about it at first, and then as soon as Norman brings up the elephant in the room, he's like, get out. But I was like, oh no, he's like squatting in like a shack.
Yeah, and
poor guy.
Like this movie, like I think this is why like Hopper got nominated or whatever, because it's like he just happened to be the player that was like depicting alcoholism or like trouble with like alcohol addiction.
But what you're saying is anybody who played this role probably would have gotten nominated.
Because like it probably was the reason why it was nominated, was like, oh, this is a more intricate, interesting role than like we usually see.
It was the same when Nicole Kidman was going to wear that fake nose and the hours. Everyone's like, ugh, the nose is going to get nominated.
I don't remember that at all.
We'll watch it.
So I just was kind of saying it's not really a great way of dealing with like alcoholism and addiction. This movie again sort of moralizes it so much like we do in our culture. Like, oh, this guy's a bad person because he's an alcoholic. Now it does lighten up on it a little bit because it does like give him a chance, this movie, over and over, and people give him a chance. Norman gives him a chance.
Well, and so like Norman, we still haven't found out like what is this big, deep, dark secret that Norman is carrying around.
Yeah.
So you do kind of get the sense of like, he's zeroed in on Shooter and is taking a chance on him, I think, because like Norman is like, I also have some skeletons in my closet. So I think that's why he sort of relates to Shooter more than like the other men in the town who probably would love to be his assistant coach.
Yeah. So at the next home game, Shooter actually surprises everyone and shows up like in a suit, and he's like trying to dry out. Clearly he's like sweating, and he's like really uncomfortable. He's got
the shakes. Yeah.
But he does like prove that he can show up. The next week after class, Everett, who is the son of Shooter, tells Norman like, hey, I don't think my dad can do this. He's a drunk. He'll just mess something up. And Norman's like, no, we'll give him a shot, kind of thing. And after that, Myra comes in and informs Norman that the town has called a meeting scheduled on Saturday in which all of Hickory's residents will decide if he will be removed as the coach. So apparently this was going on in the background, that they were just trying to overthrow him the whole time.
Yeah, again, very Music Man, town meeting. The whole town comes and they're all in their like individual townsperson outfits, and they're all doing like hubbub.
I wrote a note, pretty organized to have a town meeting of this size for basketball.
Yes.
Like they don't have other stuff going on, like family, other things, jobs.
There's not like a traffic light that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, well, it'll be only one. So they're going to have this meeting where he's going to get fired or talked about being fired, and everyone's going to vote. And then he has a game and he gets thrown out, so it doesn't look good for him. Shooter has to take over, and he kind of crumbles under the pressure. The next day, Myra finds Norman standing alone by a fence on Cletus's farm, one of the two farms they had. And she tells him about an old newspaper article that she apparently dug up at the library, which describes how Norman was suspended from college after he hit one of his players. Now this, I didn't mention it earlier, is what they based the Bobby Knight thing on. He was like, what if Bobby Knight hit one of his players in one of his rages and then had to come back?
So that didn't actually happen.
That didn't actually happen, as far as we know. But like he probably was close to doing that.
Okay.
Or he may have actually like hit people. But this was all kind of based on like a what if of a real life scenario.
Okay.
So that is the dirty secret that we finally find out.
Yes, that he hit one of his players.
His college players. And then he went to the Navy, and now he's back coaching high school.
I feel like this was how they solved problems in the 50s, was like, just join the military.
Yeah. So now we're to the actual meeting which takes place that night in a church. And Norman gives like a brief speech defending himself. Myra steps up to the lectern and she's going to like roast him as well, along with the rest of the crowd. But she chooses to not at the last second. You see her like have a change of heart. All of the residents then vote to get rid of Norman. But just as he's finishing sort of the ballot count or whatever, Jimmy Chitwood enters the church and he announces he has decided he wants to play basketball now, but only if Norman's allowed to stay.
Yeah. And this is a moment where you're like, why though? This is probably like, there was probably a deleted scene. Now that you've told me that they cut so much out of the movie, I'm like, there must have been a deleted scene, because the last time the two of Norman and Jimmy interacted was when he was like, I'm not going to bother you about playing basketball. You do your thing. And then we don't see the two of them interact. But then all of a sudden, like, Jimmy's like, my one condition of playing on the team is that this guy stays. And I'm like, just because he was like not pressuring you? I mean, like, that's a fine enough reason, I guess. But I was like, there seems to be something missing.
Yeah. Anyway, they re-vote and they let him stay because they want Jimmy. And I actually made a note here. Again, we don't know anything about Jimmy Chitwood, but it seems out of character for him to burst into a church during a pivotal vote about a basketball coach and dramatically announce in front of everyone that he will play again only if the coach stays. And I had here, he doesn't even really know the coach. So why?
No.
To your point.
We have no information. And also, like you said, like, it is very out of character because this character has barely spoken at all in like a one-on-one situation. So the idea that he would go in front of the entire town and make a statement defending someone that, like, so far based on all we've seen, like, he doesn't even know. It was confusing. It was a
little weird. So with Jimmy on the team, everyone's re-energized and they go on a winning streak. About halfway through the season, Norman counsels Shooter, who is struggling again with his sobriety. Shooter promises he won't fall off the wagon, and Norman promises he won't be ejected from any more games.
Oh, yeah, because Shooter is like, I can handle it as long as you don't, like, leave it all up to me. Yeah. So, like, please control your temper so that I don't have to be left alone taking over the team.
So at the very next home game, Norman gets himself thrown out on purpose so that Shooter can take over. Sort of a coaching moment for his assistant coach. Can you handle it?
I really take issue with this kind of stuff in movies. Like, I understand that it's supposed to be like, oh, the coach knows what he's doing. He always has a plan. And like, he just needs to let people like have the opportunity to rise to the occasion. But I'm like, maybe not with a guy who's like very much struggling with alcoholism and is still like sweating out
last night's vodka.
You know what I mean? It was just the kind of situation where I was like, I understand what the movie's trying to do here, but like, this isn't a great thing to do to somebody in this moment.
So Shooter runs the picket fence play, and that's what they win the game with. At the end of the regular season, the tournament begins, which is like the high school state tournament, I guess. At the start of Hickory's sectional game, Shooter is nowhere to be found. And then during the game, he comes running out and he's drunk and causes a whole scene. He's back in his
hobo clown outfit.
Yeah. Players, including like Shooter's son, get shoved into trophy cases. There's a whole fight with the other team. The fight breaks up and Hickory ends up winning by 2.
Because like the team they're playing, Terhune or whatever, is like their biggest rival in the sense that like they're also a really good team. Like I feel like that's been like seeded throughout the movie, because like in the beginning of the movie when those two players like leave practice, they're like, I'll go play for Terhune, and I was like, excuse me, do you not have a school district where you can't just go play for another school?
That would happen all the time though.
Really?
In like high school, yeah.
Like,
there was a town next to us called Randolph, and a lot of people would move there just for basketball.
That's wild.
And stay there a little, like hold their kids back a year so they're a year older in senior of high school, a little bigger.
That doesn't seem fully legal.
But some of them actually like went to like D1 colleges and stuff.
Good for them. It all worked out.
Like it's a crazy little small town that's like insane at basketball. I think the Jeans in Randolph, Wisconsin are like tall. Yeah.
Something in the water.
Yeah, there is. So yeah. The next day, Norman and Everett go looking for Shooter, who's been missing since he was tossed out of that game after being all drunk. They find him unconscious in a snowbank in the woods. And then Shooter also is admitted to the hospital for alcohol rehab. And that's where Norman visits him, making sure he's, on the mend or whatever. Okay, so they're playing games in this tournament. There's a game where Strap has to come in, the religious guy, because the guy gets hurt. And so this is his big moment. Ollie has his game, like the trainer guy or
the team manager who's like guy. 5 feet tall.
Yeah, he has to play. He makes some underhand free throws to secure the state finals.
He does a Rick Barry.
He does, yeah.
Which is something that I learned in the first episode of this podcast.
Yes. The following week, after Norman receives a haircut from Opal, he notices Myra is working out in the garden. They go on a walk.
Yes, this is where she's raking mud.
Yeah. He asks her if she would like to go to a movie sometime, but she responds by bringing up the incident in which he hit a college player, which is just like, Jesus. He's like, hey, do you want to go out sometime? Remember when you hit that player?
That's cold, Myra.
I get it, but like, he says he can't really explain why he did it, and then they kiss. That's literally how it's described in IMDb, and that's exactly how it happened. You're like, oh my God, is this?
You and I were on the couch. We were both sort of scowling at the TV while they were kissing, and then I turned to you and I was like, I have never wanted two people to kiss less in a movie than I do right now, for a variety of reasons, because of like what was just said, because it was just like, do you want to go to the movies? You're maybe like violent enough to like hit a teenager again. I don't know why. Kiss. Like, it didn't really make a lot of sense. The other thing too is just like the two of them don't have a lot of chemistry at all. And like, they both just looked very like cold and dry outside. And it was a very dry kiss. I don't know. Sometimes when you're watching a movie, even when you do want the people to kiss, sometimes the actual kiss itself, you're like, ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just love, that moment was an opportunity for Norman Dale to like, they could have given the character like something to say where he like reckons with the fact that he has an anger issue. Like he could have been like, yeah, I have anger problems. I joined the Navy. Everything's better now. I don't know. But instead he was just like, shrug. You want to make out?
Yeah. Something got into me. And it's like, that's not what happened. But
no.
So in the locker room on the night of the state finals that they've made it to miraculously, and Norman's reviewing game strategy, and then he has sort of his heartwarming moment where he's like, this has been a really special time for me. He asks everyone if they'd like to say anything. Merle wants to win for all the small schools that never had a chance. Everett wants to win for his dad, Shooter, who would love to be there but can't.
Because he's still drying out in the hospital.
And Buddy wants to win for Norman. And then Reverend Doty says a prayer and a Bible verse before the Huskers take the floor. And he does the Bible verse about David and Goliath.
Yes.
Even if you're a devout member of a faith, bending the text of the religion that you believe in to fit your personal sports team never feels right.
Yeah.
It never feels like what the religion is for, because it could also go for the other team. If you're saying you are the ones that God is sort of pushing to victory, that could be the same for the other team. Like, what are we doing here?
I mean, this is the same thing when players say like, thank God first after like doing something amazing. My first thought is always like, God isn't like busy doing any of the other things in the world that like really need some help. Yeah. Like there's a lot of bad stuff happening right now. Like really. The other thing here was that the actual Bible verse that they quoted was literally like, and then David hit the Philistine in the head with a rock. Have a good game, everyone. Yeah. Yeah. Like the Bible is a pretty harsh and brutal text at times. And so you have to choose your passages wisely. And I don't think this was a wise choice.
Yep. Then the game comes down to the end. They're playing against South Bend, who has a enrollment of 2,800 and they have 60. So way better, bigger school. But they hang with them and it comes all the way down to like the last shot. And they have a timeout where they're deciding what they're going to do to try to win the state final. Everyone's like, oh, we should just give the ball to Jimmy Chitwood because he's our hero. And Norman's like, everyone's going to think that. So we're going to do this other whole complicated thing. But everyone looks at him in the huddle before he decides this and is very unsure. And he actually has a moment of growth where he's like, you guys don't seem like you think that's what's right. And then they just decide to give it to Jimmy and he makes the shot and wins.
Yeah. I mean, I said this to you after we were done. I was like, really? It wasn't until this point in the season that he was like, fine, we can just go back to like shooting because we can do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, in reality, like, yeah, sure, maybe at the beginning of the season you want to work on like fundamentals and passing the ball and whatever, but it's like once you get down to the end and like all you really need to do is make sure you win, wouldn't you just get it to the star and like let them do what they can do just so that you win the game?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain degree of sticking to your plan, but yeah.
I don't know. It was just funny. I was like, it only occurred to this character now to just give the ball to the guy who makes every shot he takes. Okay.
Yeah. And then there's a final scene where they sort of slow pan back on an empty Hickory gym, which now has the state championship picture.
Yes. And you hear Norman Dale's voice in the background imparting his wisdom. And there's a little kid shooting free throws who's dressed in the same kind of outfit that Jimmy Chitwood was dressed in when we first saw him. So it really brings it back around nicely. This was the part of the movie where I was like, this is a nice little emotional moment at the end. Good for you guys. Not earned, but loved it.
Yeah. Little wrap up here at the end. Roger Ebert praised the movie in the Sun-Times when it came out. What makes Hoosiers special is not its story, but its details and its characters. Angelo Pizzo, who wrote the original screenplay, knows small town sports. He knows all about high school politics and how the school board and the parents groups always think they know more about basketball than the coach does. He knows about gossip, scandal, and vengeance, and he knows a lot about human nature. Hackman is gifted at combining likability with complexity, two qualities that usually don't go together well in movies. He projects all of the single-mindedness of any good coach, but then he contains other dimensions, and we learn about the scandal in his past that led him to this one-horse town.
Whatever movie he's writing about is a movie I would really enjoy watching. I don't know that it's this one.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say you do have to put it in context. We've had this conversation a lot of like watching movies from like the 80s, 90s, even 70s. You do have to sort of be like, let's remember that like movies were not as elegant as they are now.
True.
So like, it's somewhat freeing sometimes to watch an older movie because you're like, I'm just going to try and enjoy what I can enjoy about it, knowing that like if this were made today, they probably would have done like a more refined job with it. I say this after we've just like roasted the shit out of this movie. So like you do have to take that into account for sure. So I can understand enjoying it. It is kind of funny though. I'm sure like the people working on this movie read that review and they're like, yeah, Gene Hackman's good at pretending to be likable, given what you just told me.
Yeah. And then one last thing that's just a novelty thing that's very fun. In 2015, the Pacers made Hickory uniforms inspired
sweet.
by the movie. And I'll show you those really quick.
That's cute.
So it's like a modern Hickory Pacers jersey.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, because the uniforms they wore in this movie, I mean, I know that the shorts used to be tiny, but these were very shiny shorts and they had a little belt.
Oh my God, yeah.
Which I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah, they had very old school tiny shorts.
Oh, and belts. The Chuck Taylors. Whenever I see an old movie where like people are like actually doing sports while wearing those shoes, I'm like, y'all are going to end up with plantar fasciitis. So hard.
And then one last thing I wanted to mention, I forgot when we were talking about the state tournament. It was in a huge stadium, and there was that scene where they walked into it for the first time, which was very cool. That stadium is actually like Butler's stadium.
Butler University?
Yeah. And it was like one of the biggest college gyms for a long time.
It looked enormous. I will say like whoever like scouted the locations for this movie did a nice job because the gyms
they're all in Indiana.
Yeah. They're all
real.
just like actual like high school and college gyms, I guess.
So yeah, how many basketballs out of 5 would you give Hoosiers?
I'm gonna give it 3.
Yeah,
I'm gonna give it 3.
I would say about that too. We didn't describe some of the fun parts of this movie, which are like the montage scenes with the synth music and stuff. I think that's what makes this legendary.
Yeah,
like especially that scene where they go into the huge gym at Butler and he measures the free throw line and he measures the height of the hoop. And then he goes to his team, same as our gym back home.
Yeah.
Like, just sort of proving the point, like, the game still played the same.
No, I actually, like, that was, like, probably one of my favorite moments in the whole movie because, I don't know, I just really responded to that of, like, yes, the stakes may be higher, but the circumstances are the same, and just do what you do. That was one of the, like, Gene Hackman as the coach where you're like, what's he doing here? What's he trying to prove? That was, like, a circumstance where I was like, okay, he finished his thought and I understand what the point of that was.
And I think I've finished all my thoughts.
As have I.
About Hoosiers.
Yeah.
So we will leave you with that and we'll be back with another episode in a couple weeks.
If you're missing us in between, you're like, I'm out of episodes. There's a whole bunch of them on our Patreon and you can become a subscriber.
Yep. You can get the audio for $3 a month and the audio and video for $5 a month. And yeah, that's what we're offering over on Patreon. We will see you next time.
Oh, ho, the Wells Fargo wagon is coming down the street. Oh, please let it be for... Jim hates this.
Is that Music Man?
Yeah.